self-settle is where a dog chooses to lie down and relax without the need for a verbal cue. Of course, there are still environmental and physical cues which inform the dog which behaviours will earn reinforcement. So the dog is on lead in this case and the handler is not interacting with them. If you're at home or in a cafe, you may also use a mat on the floor for the dog to settle on. Why not just cue a down? Well, you can, but the self-settle does come with benefits. So if we're out with our dog and we get distracted, the dog's already been taught how to behave when we're not telling them what to do and we're not giving them any other instruction. The other thing that we need to bear in mind is that when we ask the dog to lie down, we need to make sure that they remain in that position until they're released. This would be unfair if we were, say, having a meal that could last an hour or so. The self-settle allows the dog to reposition themselves when needed, while still maintaining the basic criteria of 4 feet on the floor, loose lead and quiet. Yes, ideally we want them in a relaxed down, and that's where the best reinforcement is, but it's not a problem if they do need to change position. Before starting to train this exercise, it's absolutely essential that your dog's got good basic food manners. It's also really useful if they've got a history of being reinforced for settling on their bed. This video shows an example of capturing, where the handler observes the dog, and when the dog offers the behaviour that we like, which is to go and lie down on a mat or on a bed, we notice that and we go and reinforce it. You can teach this exercise without a mat, but using one does have its advantages. It can be an additional cue for the dog, and particularly if you've used capturing like we've just talked about, the dog may very quickly settle on the mat because they've got a previous history of being rewarded for that behaviour. It's more comfortable for the dog, and it makes positioning them in, say, the corner of a restaurant really easy. It also builds a positive reinforcement history on the mat, which makes teaching things like place, which is go and lie down on the mat or bed, really easy. As always, start teaching this exercise in a quiet, distraction-free environment and keep your sessions short and frequent. We can work on duration later. Place your dog on lead and put a large mat on the floor. Use a hand target if needed to position the dog on the mat. Give yourself something to do. This prevents you staring at the dog and the dog gazing back at you. You may not believe it, but this is this dog's first session at self-settle, and she came to me with attention-seeking behaviours. But I did do an awful lot of capturing when she was on a bed, and that's what made teaching this really easy. Plan ahead and decide what behaviours you're going to reinforce. A good starting point is a loose lead, 4 feet on the mat and quiet. How you progress after that and your rate of reinforcement will very much depend on each individual. If the dog doesn't offer the behaviour you want quickly, you've made it too difficult, so make it easier. This should be really easy money for the dog. I choose not to use a marker word when training this behaviour. When I see the dog do something that I like, I feed them slow and low, so the food is always placed in between their paws on the mat. Always make sure that you release the dog at the end of the session, so you can use a verbal OK or a hand target to move them off the bed. Then make sure you pick up the bed and move it out the way, ready for the next training session. Here's a recap of the steps that you may need to go through, and just bear in mind that you may need to spend a few sessions at each step. 2 of the criteria will apply at every stage, and that's loose lead and quiet. So initially we may just be looking for 4 paws on the mat, so be kind to yourself and use a large mat. Then a sit, and next a down. To help avoid any attention-seeking behaviours creeping in, look for opportunities to reinforce the dog when they're looking away rather than staring right at you. It should then be easy to progress to reinforcing them for a more relaxed down. If you're struggling for opportunities to reinforce the dog when they're not staring right at you, then practice in the garden or sit on a bench on a quiet street, and that'll help to try and take some of the focus away from the food. Also, assess the value of food that you're using, as it may be too high. Don't forget, even in the early stages where you may be reinforcing the dog for standing on the mat, always feed slow and low and not fast or high. It only takes this dog 2 repetitions of feeding her quite high up before she decides to reach up and meet the treat part way, and then she moves fully into a sit. So placement of the food makes a huge difference on this one. Once your dog can settle reliably for a couple of minutes, you can gradually add duration, remembering to reinforce after varying amounts of time. As long as your dog enjoys it, you can also use verbal and physical praise too. It doesn't always have to be food. When first introducing distractions, initially reduce duration, and you can practice when the kids are playing near you or you're eating your lunch. You can also invite friends over for a meal, which makes the experience more like real life. Finally, we need to practice in lots of different and gradually more distracting environments. And don't forget, you'll probably need to make it easier each time you visit a new location. Fingers crossed, your dog is now an expert at the self-settle. But don't worry if things aren't going entirely to plan. If your dog starts to chew the lead or vocalise, then stop the session. This prevents you from reinforcing less desirable behaviours, and it gives you thinking time so that you can plan ahead and try and prevent this being repeated next time. If you're still having problems, then keep a lookout for a troubleshooting tutorial.